Good day everyone. So a lot of people have been throwing around this sort of graph that you can see in the background. It's the 3.1 spiral abyss usage rates, and obviously you can see Kokomi is like way at the top, and people have been trying to use this as a justification for all sorts of things, but let me just tell you straight up, this entire thing is garbage. So what we'll do in this video is we'll look at why this is garbage. We'll look at what are some of the sound statistical principles towards actually designing a good method for collecting this type of data, and then we'll also look at a good example of applying those principles. So let's just sort of get this out of the way. You cannot conclude anything from this chart. So how do we know this? Well, there are a couple of sound statistical principles that we can follow. So the first one is, do you have a large and representative sample size? In this case, you can see here, we only have about 1,000 samples, and that is not large, and that's not representative enough of the Genshin Impact community. So immediately straight off we can just sort of tick it no. The second good principle is the information that we got sampled identically and independently? In other words, when people filled in the data, did you ensure that there was only one unique response? And as far as my understanding is of a survey, this is almost like a self-reported survey, and it did not in any way prevent people from entering duplicate data. Now, having duplicate data is not a problem if that sort of duplicate set comes from different people. In other words, if two people used the same teams, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that there is a unique correspondence to each input. So a good way of doing this is to query Hoyoverse's API and get the information that would be publicly available from all of those players that have made their profiles public on the Hoyoverse website. So that is a good method of doing it. It solves double counting and so on. So from my understanding and reading about this survey, no, this is not sampled identically and independently, so we can of course just write it off. The other thing is, for time sensitive data, what you want to do is you want to sample the entire period under consideration. So for data like this, you can't have Nilo in it 4 days after she's been released. That is not a good representation of anything, because the problem, as you can logically think of it, is you have this new character, everyone tries out this new character, so obviously her rates would be pretty much inflated, and hence you can't really conclude anything, because for every, if Nilo's rates are like high, obviously she had to replace someone else, and hence that other character's rates might be artificially lower. So once again, this did not actually work out. Now I did see that there was a different sample as well from 2.4 to 3.1, a sort of consolidated one, but the problem that you've got to recognize with those things is that when you're consolidating different periods, you need to use a sort of a weighting scheme, because regimes and metas do shift in Genshin Impact. We do have new characters, new mechanics, and these things can affect the meta. So again, on this survey, it completely failed. And then finally, the last thing you need to do is you need to sense check your data, either heuristically or against known mathematical models. So a heuristic in this case would be, if Kokomi is at the top of the meta, I do expect Sucrose to have at least a 10% pick rate. Why? Because in Hyperbloom teams, in Taser teams, in Freeze teams, in all sorts of other teams with Kokomi, Sucrose is kind of a very, very important like ingredient. In fact, it's not just with Kokomi, but with many of these other teams, having Sucrose at a 4.2 sort of rate here immediately screams like alarm bells to me. Heuristically, it does not make sense. If at the very least I'd expect Fischl and Sucrose to have more or less the same pick rate. So just that discrepancy alone is enough to make me not trust any of this data. And also, if you look here, Beidou typically used with Kokomi in Taser teams is not that high as well, which is also kind of funny. Or Beidou with a child like Taser teams, it's just, heuristically I cannot sort of agree with this sort of sample data. So yeah, on all 4 counts it sort of fails. Obviously there are other reasons why you might think that this fails. So let's look at a good example now of how to actually do this. And a good example is what you can see here, what the guys did at GenshinWishes.com. So first of all, this is like a website where they collect people that willingly submit their wishes. Obviously there is a unique method of collecting it, so you don't have people double counting. But what you can see is we have about 14 million wishes. So A, we actually have a good large representative sample size. We know that the information is identically and independently sampled, which is really, really good. It's correct for the time sensitive period because we're only looking, for instance, here at the 2.21 banner, and we looked at the entire period of all of the wishes. And also we know mathematically that this sort of data should be correct. We should expect from the in-game description that you have a more or less pretty much even spread between these characters. We know mathematically that there will be a slight decrease in these wishes as you go, because that's just a property of the geometric quantities, or the geometric nature of the sort of pulling rates. And we know from the very fact that Hoya promised you a base pull rate and a sort of higher consolidated rate, that somehow we have to make up that sort of missing probability. And if you sort of really work out the averages here, you'll get to a number that's about 1.6015%, which is so close to what Hoya promises in game. In other words, we've gotten all of the sense checks, the heuristic checks, everything pretty much done, and hence you can use this data to get some very interesting results. You can break it down by geography, you can do it by sort of looking at the pull rates of characters, the probability models, etc, and it's also how and when people sort of pulled for it. So this is a very good example of a survey that does conform to most of the sound statistical principles. So yeah, this means nothing. People use it to justify all sorts of things, but if your data is false, you can sort of infer almost any conclusion from it. It's what we call a vacuous truth, and you should not pay attention to anyone that gives you any conclusions. And even if those conclusions include that Bennett and Kazuo are at the top, much the same way, if you can't trust the data, it doesn't matter what it says, what you want to believe, even if heuristically, even if we know from a meta perspective these characters should be at the top, because the data is so suspect, we cannot conclude anything legitimate from it. Right, that's it from my side. Cheers.